Welcome to the first video in a series on Mimesis, which is a very famous book by the German writer Erich Auerbach. And in this video, I just want to talk about his bio and his method in terms of interpreting both literature and the historical past. So let's start with his bio. Now we can say about him that he was a Prussian Jew, and for much of his life he lived in Germany. He was a professor at the university in Marburg, but something very significant happened in 1935. In that year, he was ousted from his position, and you can probably understand why with the Nazis in power. And he left Marburg. He left Marburg in Germany, and he ended up living in exile. Put an R in there. In Istanbul, in Turkey. So there he was in Istanbul during the Second World War, and between about 1942 and 1945, he wrote Mimesis without access to some of the best libraries in Europe. And he actually credits his exile as being kind of what led him to create this momentous book, because instead of being able to zoom in to every last detail, he had to be a little bit more general. And so he could really have this massive scope and write a history of realism, which is what this book is, that goes all the way from the classics to modernity. Now, I did mention that he was a Jew, but he was also quite secular in his outlook. And I'll give you one example here. In the first chapter, when he's talking about the Old Testament, he tries to capture the Jewish attitude towards God. And this is what he says. The concept of God held by the Jews is less a cause than a symptom of their manner of comprehending and presenting things. And what he means by that is that they have a general outlook on life, the Jews do. So culturally, they're very unique. And as a result, they also present God in a particular unique way. And you can see there how he starts with culture and then moves to the concept of the divine, as opposed to the other way around. So we can definitely see that he's very secular, but at the same time, I think he was very affected by the Holocaust. And he talks in his book about how he's not sure if after the war this book will reach his friends. You can tell that he's very lonely and isolated. And there are many, many passages that I think are autobiographical. So when you read the book, really watch for that, because he'll be talking about an author and it seems far removed from his own life. And then suddenly you think, yeah, but this applies to the Second World War as well. Let me read you one particularly striking passage from the second or third chapter. This is where he's talking about the classical writer Ammianus, and he says this. Ammianus's world is very often a caricature of the normal human environment in which we live. Very often it is like a bad dream. This is not simply because horrible things happen in it, treason, torture, persecution, denunciations. Such things are prevalent in almost all times and places, and the periods when life is somewhat more tolerable are not too frequent. You can really hear a sense of pessimism there. What makes Ammianus's world so oppressive is the lack of any sort of counterbalance. For if it is true that man is capable of everything horrible, it is also true that the horrible always engenders counterforces, and that in most epochs, most historical periods, of atrocious occurrences, the great vital forces of the human soul reveal themselves. Love and sacrifice, heroism in the service of conviction, and the ceaseless search for possibilities of a pure existence. And I think in that passage you get a little bit of a sense of Auerbach's humanism. So we definitely have proof of his humanism, his sense that the spirit of humanity will prevail somehow despite the darkness. And there's this constant striving for a pure existence. I think Auerbach feels that reading literature, great literature from the past, is one thing that will help us transcend some of the darkness, certainly as experienced in World War II. So the book is deeply affected by Auerbach's own life, by World War II, and I think it's really critical that we understand some of that. One more detail about his life before we move on to his methodology. And this last detail is that in terms of his profession, we can call him a Romance philologist. I know that sounded like it was going to be really romantic, and then we ended up with philology. Philologist. So what is that? Well, first of all, Romance refers to those languages that are descended from Latin, right? Like French and Italian. And that was really his specialty, although he does talk about authors from other contexts too. Philology is kind of a discipline that we don't have in the modern university anymore. These days we have all kinds of disciplines that have descended from it. And philology really started out as a study of languages, particularly the classical languages and also Sanskrit. So when Europeans, there we go, Sanskrit. When people went to India, for instance, they recognized that some Eastern languages were remarkably similar in their structure and in their origin to European languages. And as a result, they wanted to study these things, and they realized that perhaps there was a kind of Ur language, a kind of previous language that all of these things descend or originated from. And this language is often called Indo-European. Now, philology is more than just the study of languages. It's also the editing of texts, creating good, usable texts of literary works. It's the study of the culture that these texts reveal. And so it's a very broad discipline. And these days we have split this into many specific disciplines, whether it's linguistics or English or modern languages, whatever it may be. So to be a Romance philologist, then, to be able to speak, a dozen languages, it takes incredible talent, incredible learning. And that's one of the reasons why Mimesis is so famous, because it really showcases Auerbach's impressive learning and the way he can talk about texts from vastly different periods and start to create this narrative. Now, the next question then is, well, what is the narrative of this book? What is this book about? And really, I would say it's a kind of history of realism in literature. Okay, so the development of realism. In this book, we move from two very old writers, Homer on the one hand, and an Old Testament writer, okay, who's often referred to as the Elohist. And these two writers are the starting point, but eventually we're going to end up with modernism. And the example is Virginia Woolf. Actually, there's a lot more focus in the book on the 19th century than on Virginia Woolf. The Woolf chapter feels almost more like it's kind of added on to bring the narrative up to date, but I think you get the picture here. What's fascinating about this is that there's a development here. Realism changes, but we start with a Jewish writer and we end with Virginia Woolf, right? Who was married to a Jewish writer herself, and there's something, I think, Jewish in her writing for Auerbach. So there's a very interesting connection there, that what we end with maybe harkens back to the beginning. Okay, now let's move on from there then. If we think then about this development of realism, we have to tie this to the concept of mimesis. So mimesis, what is this then? Well, we could just say it's realism, but that's not quite accurate. The word mimesis here refers to copying something. And in fact, mimesis is an extremely broad concept. Auerbach only uses a fairly narrow definition of this. What he's talking about is how art copies reality, right? So art copies reality. And if it does it well, then we can say, well, it's realistic, or there's an element of realism. And if it does it badly, we could say, well, this is more abstract. So if you think of something we see in the real world. We see a tree, let's say, and then we put up our artist's easel. Now we have to make a choice. Are we going to depict that tree as we think we see it? Or are we going to be like, I don't know, we can make a more abstract version of this. Let's see here. Let's just make this entirely green. There we go. That's our tree. Which one is more realistic? I think instinctively we say, well, the one that's more realistic is obviously the actual tree. But there's a broader question here, because I think the question is, who decides what is mimetic? Who decides what is realistic? And that's a very difficult question to answer. In fact, it's a question that brings up the issue of what's often called the hermeneutic circle. Okay, so the hermeneutic circle. What is that? Well, let's talk about this very briefly here. So hermeneutic has to do with interpretation. You could call this the interpretive circle. And the idea here is that if you start with a certain conception, like a prejudice or a belief system, how do you know that you can be objective about what you're looking for? It's the classic idea of, well, if you're going to look for something, you're sure to find it, right? Like if you Google something, you're going to find it because it's somewhere. It really begs the question, or it raises the question, I should say, is there anything that is truly objective about interpretation? Can we really find what we're looking for without already having some kind of preconception? And that's why people talk about whether you can get out of the hermeneutic circle, whether you can avoid it and allow new information, new viewpoints to really enter into your interpretation. So if we apply this then to this question of realism, I think the big question is, well, if we already come with a preconception of what is realistic, is that not going to prejudice us? Because now we're just going to go through literature and say, well, this one, meets our criteria for realism, and this one does not, maybe a little bit. And then the third one, well, it's a check mark here, but not there, and so on. And you can see that if we start out with too clear conception, that may be problematic. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people feel that Auerbach does start out with that kind of conception. And let me just give you a few examples of the kinds of things he feels are realistic. He talks about things that are random. So that's one of his favorite words. There's no pattern to real life. And I think we might agree with him on that one. He also talks about things that are tragic. Life is sad sometimes, and we have to capture that. But Auerbach does tend to privilege the tragic over the comic, which I think is kind of a blind spot in his work. He also talks a lot about the vernacular, so the speech of the people. And again, is that necessarily more realistic? Other languages, more formal ones, are also spoken in reality. So lots of questions about that one. He prefers literature that is about everyday people, right? Real people. And he seems to have a little bit of a prejudice against literature that's for the upper classes, which he is correct in saying that kind of literature is just a thin slice of life, but it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily or that it's not realistic. And then one more, I think that's really critical. This last one is the idea of a kind of self-consciousness about history. So we'll call this self-conscious historicism. In other words, Auerbach likes literary texts that are very self-aware in terms of actually giving you a sense of how history develops over time. There's almost like a theory of history in the text. He also likes to talk about sociological criticism, as if a literary text should be a sociology manual. So these are some of the things that he prefers, and you can decide whether you like that or not, whether you think this is problematic in terms of the hermeneutic circle, or whether you agree that, yes, these are some of the features of realism. And that brings us to the last part of our discussion of methodology, which is this concept of history. I would say that Auerbach is quite Hegelian often. He's very influenced by Hegel. There are other influences as well, but I think this one is one that's worth mentioning at this point. So I'm going to give you a very simplistic version of Hegel here, but Hegel really talks about big historical time periods, right? And we call these epochs. And Auerbach has this desire to split history into epochs as well, although he's a little less rigid, I think, than Hegel sometimes. But in any case, Hegel talks a lot about how in history and in philosophy, we tend to have this dichotomy where we start with a thesis, a position, or an outlook on life, and then over time, we will get an antithesis or an antithesis, which is the opposite point of view, right? People disagree with the earlier perspective. If you look at this in Auerbach's book, he starts exactly with this. His thesis is that in the classical period, we have a division of styles. A division of styles. And what he means by that is that we have a high style and we have a low style. And we can also assign different kinds of literature to these styles. So the high style would be things like tragedy, right? And epic. And the low style would be things like comedy. Okay. Now, for Auerbach, this is not necessarily a realistic approach to life, to divide these things into styles. He doesn't like this so much because he feels that this privileging of the high style is constantly giving you a look at the aristocratic class, at the upper classes, but it's ignoring big parts of life. It's not talking about as much about common people. And he prefers actually a different approach, which you could call the kind of Judeo-Christian approach. And here we're talking about something like the Bible. Okay, so let's just use yellow here, actually. We'll just turn this into a yellow, ugly arrow. So in terms of the Bible, here we have a mixture of styles. A mixture of styles. And the question then is, which one is better? Which one is more sublime? So sublime is where something is really awesome, right? It gives you kind of chills down your spine. In the classical version, in the division of styles, it was the high style that was the most sublime. But Auerbach wants to say that the Bible actually creates a mixture where we have stories about really common, ordinary people, sometimes doing very embarrassing things, like Peter in the Bible who denies Christ, right? But according to Auerbach, that's extremely sublime. Okay, so he actually feels that this is more sublime than what we get in classical literature. This is his starting point, this kind of thesis, antithesis dichotomy. But in any opposition like this, as Hegel suggests, there has to be what he refers to as a synthesis. So these things are going to come together, and there has to be some kind of synthesis, some reconciliation. I think you can see this as the book develops, as Mimesis develops, when he starts talking about writers like Augustine, Dante. These were writers who were really influenced by both of these things. They read the Bible, they wanted to create Christian art, Christian texts, and yet they loved the classical sense of style. So how are they going to reconcile these things? Well, they had to create some kind of synthesis. And as the book develops then, what we start to see is that this synthesis is going to lead to a new thesis. This synthesis will become a new thesis, and then, there we go. And then that will spark a new antithesis, and the process will go on. Now, it's never quite this sharp or this clear in the book, but I think there's a lot of Hegelian influences, even down to some of the word choices. And I'll give you just one example here. When he's talking about Dante, he uses the word annihilation a number of times. Annihilation. Where one thing gets annihilated by something else. And it seems like a really odd word choice, but it's very much a Hegelian kind of word, because when we talk about this antithesis, This process of moving through antithesis to synthesis, this is often referred to as sublation, which is kind of a jargony term, and it's not the greatest one perhaps. But sublation refers to a number of things. It refers to how one thing gets raised to another level, or how it retains what was old, but it adds something new. Or even it destroys what came before and it creates something new, right? It annihilates. It's very difficult to kind of say exactly what sublation is. It's many things at the same time. So when he talks about annihilation, then there is Hegel. And I think we see that all the way through, the sense that history should be thought of in terms of these big patterns. Now there's one very final thing then, and this is his approach in each individual chapter. When Auerbach starts a chapter, he always starts with a passage from a particular literary text, and he'll quote a few paragraphs to give you a sense. This is what he likes to think of as, in German, his Ansatzpunkt. So his Ansatzpunkt, which is fun to say, you should try it. And that means his starting point. What he then tends to do is he wants to make this text, this very small snippet, symbolic for the entire culture, right? It represents the culture at large. Now, it's not always exactly an equal sign. Sometimes there's antagonism between the text and the culture. Sometimes they're at odds with each other. But very often also it's representative of a larger trend within society. And the pattern that we see here then is that the text is almost like a synecdoche, right? A synecdoche, which is where a part represents the whole, like your hand represents your whole body, let's say, or a sail represents the ship, let's say. So a part represents the whole, and the text in the same way represents the culture at large. This is very controversial, I think, because he makes so much of one little snippet each time, and yet it's incredibly masterly. Every time he impresses you by just what he all pulls out of one passage. And I think that's why the book feels both kind of like impressionistic, subjective, and yet it's so broad and it's so epic in its scope. And it feels like you have this master craftsman who's constructing this incredible interpretive architecture that you kind of go along with it, and you say, wow, this is fascinating, I got to read on. So hopefully that gets you into the book a little bit in terms of the bio and the methodology, and in the next video we'll talk about chapter 1.